couple of friends that were in special ops, and they would do whether it was tours or what their duty, wherever they were, like if they were in like jungles and whatnot. One of the things that you would do when you're in jungles and when there's lions and cats, large cats around, they would tell you is that you put your sunglasses, on the back of your hat. Basically, and what that would look like if a cat was, because a lot of times these cats will come up from behind and attack you. But by switching the sunglasses is basically representing that there's a set of eyes in the back of your head looking out.
That was George Daniel making an analogy between cats in the jungle and flies for predatory fish.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today. We'll help you on your fly fishing journey with classic stories covering steelhead fishing, fly tying, and much more.
I wanted to give a quick shout out to a new patron this week, Tyler T. Thank you for your support. Head over to wetflyswing.com/Patreon. That's Patreon. How's it going, everyone? Thanks for stopping by the Fly Fishing Show. In today's episode, I interviewed George Daniel from livingonthefly.com. We get into a nice discussion about one of his big mentors, Joe Humphries, and the influence he's had on his life. We also talk about why his big passion is set around fishing musky now, what his teaching philosophy is all about, and his take on competitive fly fishing. Don't miss this, as George gives us the best resource for understanding entomology and the bugs in your stream. Before I get into the episode today, I wanted to take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. The Gray Drake produces beautiful vintage fly boxes and wallets that are handmade in the USA. Made with sustainable cork, reducing environmental impacts, and still providing for the highest quality product. A portion of all proceeds go to local fish conservation. Go to thegraydrake.com to get started today. We are also brought to you by the Portland Fly Shop, which is your winter steelhead headquarters. They stock all of the top brands and a huge selection of fly tying materials. Conveniently located right off Gleason Street off of 405. It's always great to walk into the store when you're greeted by a friendly dog and and personalized service. So head over to theportlandflyshop.com or stop in and see him today. So without further ado, here's George Daniel from livingonthefly.com.
How's it going, George?
It's going great, Dave. Yourself?
Good to have you on. You've got when you look at your career or your experience fly fishing, you've got a pretty diverse background, lots of books, lots of, just a lot of information out there on all sorts of different topics. I'm hoping today, we can dig a little bit into a little bit of the teaching philosophy, because that's pretty much what you do. And, I know there's a lot of people out there that love to learn from you. Before we get into it, do you want to start with a little bit on your background, how you got into fly fishing?
Yeah, pretty simple. It was, probably 6 years old was when I caught my first fish on the fly. But essentially, I grew up in a north central Pennsylvania trout town. It was a little tributary that dumped into a well-known trout stream called Kettle Creek. But long story short, it was a kids-only section. I was the only kid in the town that fished, so I had my own private brook trout fishery up until I was about 14 years old. And My father introduced me to fishing, but my mom was the one that kind of really encouraged me and took me out and kind of nourished that excitement. But basically, I would say the environment more than anything else created the angler. We were a one-car family. My dad worked outside of town quite a bit, so I was stuck in this remote village. It's actually a village in north central PA, and that's all I had to do was just kind of fish and hunt early in my days, and it was a good way to grow up as a kid. So I definitely would say that the place where I grew up really created the angler in me.
Mm-hmm. And then where, as you went along, and where are you at now located?
I'm in State College, Pennsylvania. So if anyone's familiar with Penn State University, and from a geographic standpoint, if you were to put a pin in the dead center part of Pennsylvania, that's where I'm at. So we have pretty much a rural community where I'm at. Lots of rolling hills. When people think about Pennsylvania, they think like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, metropolitan urban areas. But Where I'm at is very rural, right outside the state college. Any like 20 minutes in either direction. It's farmlands. We have like an 18-acre piece of property right here. We have lots of Amish neighbors, lots of small rolling hills, mostly elevated. The mountains, we call them here, are probably like 2,300 feet. Not really mountains, so to speak, but they are by East Coast standards. But just lots of green. And in every one of those little valleys, there's all kinds of nooks and crannies. In every one of those little valleys, there's water, and most of them are trout streams. And if I remember correctly, I think Pennsylvania has more miles of trout water than any other stream in the lower 48. Now, granted, it's skewed. I mean, we've got these little intermittent streams that are, 2-3 feet wide that hold trout, but we have lots and lots of trout water where I live.
Mm-hmm. And then, so as you got into it, how did you get into fully into where you're at now with all your, everything you've written and done over the years? How did that all develop into a full time? Well, I don't know if it's a full time job, but kind of your career. Do you mostly guide now?
I would say within the last 3-4 years, I kind of had after graduate school, I worked for the state of Pennsylvania. I did stream restoration work, habitat enhancement. So I had a good run with the state for about 6 years doing that. And then had a full-time job with a local fly shop, TCO fly shop. And either I was the assistant manager or managed that shop for a total of 6 years. And then just about 4 years ago, I went into guiding full time. Now, I've been guiding and doing lessons and educations and programs since I was 18, but I just kind of took the leap of faith about 4 years ago and went into it full time. But it's been a good run. I mean, I've had phenomenal teachers, and I would say probably a guy named Joe Humphries, who actually just turned 90. And now they just did a story about him called Live the Stream, but he's a 90-year-old man now that's traveling around like a rock star doing all these films, these film debuts all across the country right now, showing his documentary, which is great. But Joe took me under his wing when I was really about 18, 19, and he really got me into not only just teaching me how to become a better angler, but he was an educator. He taught the angling course at Penn State University, and he took a lot of his time and taught me how to teach and educate and entertain people. So I would say just the influence of Joe alone was the part of my life that really jump started me to want to become an educator in fly fishing.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So yeah, you were, as far as mentors, had one of the best, probably, that you can imagine. What, so that's pretty cool. Now, in Joe, I actually just recently interviewed Frank Moore, who's kind of on the steelhead side of it, but kind of similar, 95 years old. He's the same thing, man. He's got the handshake that pretty much, he feels like he's, still a young buck out there and everything. But now, what do you think with Joe? So what was the biggest thing that he taught you when you look at kind of education and teaching and that whole philosophy?
Well, with Joe, the one thing I like about Joe is he's legit. There are people that are good writers that are not necessarily good anglers, and vice versa. But Joe was one that, he's written several books. He wrote magazine articles. He did a number of DVDs, but he's someone who walked the walk. When he talked about a technique or anything in his writing, it was something that he had spent years actually kind of refining down to perfection. So Joe, basically taught me to have credibility, basically. He said, anytime you talk about a subject, whether it's in your writing or to a group, you need to be credible. You need to be able to actually do what you're saying, which is not always the case, in not just in our field, but in a lot of fields. And, the other thing about Joe, Joe was tough love. The thing I love about Joe is, he was a former boxer. He wrestled for Penn State. He's just a tough guy. A similar thing to Frank. He has kind of a gridlock handshake. Even at 90, he can. But what's cool is, like, part of that documentary, Joe was even, there's a guy named Cal Sanderson who's the wrestling coach at Penn State. They've won like 4 or 5 of the last national championships. But Cal's a fisherman. Joe, is a big wrestling fan. So Joe's like, even at like 89 last year, he was on the mat with some of the national champions. Obviously, he wasn't going full speed, but he's got excitement, and he just loves life, and he loves to learn. And I think that's one of the secrets to guys like Frank and Joe. The reason why their longevity is so great is because they're always looking forward to that next step, learning something new, fishing new water. And I think it's a great metaphor, not just for fishing, but for life too, is actually having something to look forward to, like a purposeful life. And that's one of the things that Joe taught me, was to actually look forward to the things in fly fishing are immense, because there's always something to learn. And if you just sit down and relax and take in the lessons that come to you, it's going to get you excited to learn the next lesson. And in doing so, you're going to have a purposeful life, and hopefully a long and healthy life as well.
Mm-hmm. What do you think it is that you look forward to most when it comes to fly fishing or life? What kind of keeps you going?
Well, I'm an introvert that I love people. I really do. I just, I guess it's small dosages, but I really, the one thing about guiding and education is you get to meet some pretty interesting folks, and just, from CEOs to truck drivers to mechanics. I mean, just people from all walks of life. And the melting pot, and what brings all these people together is this thing we call fly fishing. And so I'm always fascinated to actually hear about people's stories. Everyone's got a great story, and I'm always willing to listen to it. It kind of keeps me excited about learning from the next person. But then too, with fishing, there's always something to learn. So whether it's hanging out with, like, fishing with great anglers, like with Lance or Lance and Devin Olsen. I think Devin was on your podcast. Yeah. Or even like clients, a client showing you one of their favorite patterns, or a mistake that they made that actually got them into a fish that kind of created this whole new approach to the way you guide. So long story short, like every time I'm on the water, there's always something to be learned. And I journal extensively. I think, it's not like I'll journal 20, 30 minutes a day, but after every trip, there's usually like one or two sticking points, talking points that I'll write down. And to be honest with you, the great thing about what I do with writing is, I'm starting to do a lot more writing. Like, I have a blog now. Mm-hmm. I'm not planning on making any money off it, but it's just like running is to the body. I think writing is to the mind. It's good exercise for it. And the thing I really like about the fly fishing is it keeps you relevant, in the sense that there's always something to be learned, and it allows you to focus on those things during your writing process. So it gives me countless material, basically, when I'm by just guiding, basically, because people have so many people. There's a lot of common problems that people have with fly fishing, but then also there's a lot of unique problems that people have. Just the way that they hold the rod and so forth, and all of that. What you are as a fly fishing guide and instructor is a problem solver. You have to look at each situation scenario differently, and really become like a consultant and try to help them out to the best of your ability. And in doing so, again, it gives you so much material to work with. So that's one of the reasons why I do what I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned writing. I actually just I interviewed John Gierach in episode 47. And we talked quite a bit about, his writing, his background, and, he's obviously written a number of really great books. And, but I dug in pretty deep, and I think maybe some people wanted to hear more about fishing, but I was just interested in hearing his writing process. And he shared a few really good tips of books and writers that helped him, get there. But it sounds like you, obviously, you've kind of got an education, you've done plenty of writing. I mean, what have you written? You've got books, magazines. Is there anything that sticks out as something that you're, kind of most proud of, or something that you really resonated with you, over other things?
Not necessarily. I would say probably my most recent blogs are probably some of my best writing. It's just, the thing, it's tough for me to call myself a writer, because John Gierach, he is a writer, and the thing about John is he's a crossover writer. So people who don't even fly fish, his writing is so good that people who don't even fly fish will still read his work just because of how he can paint the picture and paint the scenario. What I am is more of a technical writer. So, any idiot can basically talk about what they see, and that's kind of what I do. And it is not to put myself down, but it's a completely different category of what he does, because what he's doing, he's putting characters and he's telling the storyline, and there's a lot more work that goes involved with his type of writing versus mine. But with mine, it's what I focus in on is the people who I look up to. I look outside of fly fishing. One of my favorite coaches of all time, period, was a guy named John Wooden. And John coached UCLA, but John wrote a number of books, mostly on leadership, but some on basketball. But Coach John Wooden was a very clear and concise coach, the way he talked and coached his kids, but then also when he writes or when he wrote, it was very clear and concise. So I try to mimic my writing after how Coach Wooden would write with his fishing books, just simple, to the point. And with fly fishing, there's so many barriers. People try to make it as complicated. Sometimes they overword, they try to exaggerate just a little too much. Basically, I just try to take the most basic concepts and explain why things happen. With fishing, people often just want like a cookie cutter recipe. If you want to fish your nymphs under indicator, it's always 1.5 times depth. That works. Don't get me wrong, that works. But when I write, I try to teach people how to think, not to tell them what to do, but basically teach them how to think about looking at the scenarios, looking at the variables, how you rig is going to affect your drift. So I basically try to write the way Coach John Wooden, and I'm not even comparing myself. I just strive to be as good of an educator as Coach John Wooden. And that's the one thing about life too. Again, you're always looking forward to something. So my writing is adequate. It can get the job done, but I know I can do so much better. So I actually have a friend right now who's a literary teacher at a local community college about a couple hours away, but he's starting to coach me on writing. So every time I'm doing blogs, I'll send a blog his way and he'll critique it. I mean, it's sometimes below the belt, which is very well deserved on my part, but I'm always looking to get better, whether I'm teaching or writing. So hopefully my writing is getting better now throughout the years, with practice and also with the right coach.
Yep. No, it's good. It's good to hear I think that's what separates the people, the good ones from the people not so good, is that they're always striving to get better at their craft. And yeah, we've talked actually quite a bit, about writing on here. I've had all sorts of different editors of different magazines and things like that. And, I think the biggest take home message is just doing the work. You gotta read, you gotta write a lot, you gotta keep writing. And then that's the way you become good. You become a better writer. And so, I mean, I think that's just for life and anything, Roy. That's kind of the way it is. Fly fishing, right? You gotta get out there and fly fish. But, so I wanted to check in a little bit with you on, we talked a little bit about, and again, teaching, sticking on that topic with kids, is there a different, when you kind of think about, teaching kids, how do you get started? Maybe you can talk about a few tips, for people that maybe have kids and they want to get them into fly fishing. And then as you get into that, maybe we can talk about this 5 to 6 week road trip you took with your kids, which is pretty amazing. I mean, that's a month and a half of a road trip. That sounds like there's got to be some good action there. And how old are your kids?
They're actually, one is 8. The other one will be 10 here in a couple months, but we've been doing this with our kids now since they were basically 6 and 8 respectively. So for the last couple of years, once they were like 6 and 8, they were old enough that we could take them on the road. And so 6 and 8, and what's the difference between 6 and 8 versus 4 and 6? So at least with our kids, it was to the point where the kids could be outside for an extended period of time without whining, without complaining, and they can walk in probably 80% of the water or the environment that we went in. So they basically could take care of themselves for the most part. Obviously there were places where you need to wade and kind of help them out. But once they were able to become a little more self-sustaining themselves, that was when I knew we could take them out. But we live close to trout water, and we have a pond on our property, so we fish with the kids every day. Our old house that we lived at, we had a trout stream literally about 50 yards away from our house. So every evening the kids were out on the water fishing with me. So eventually we got a handle and to a point where we could just sense when they were ready to go on a big road trip with us. But, with teaching kids, I mean, what works for one group of kids is not going to necessarily work for the other. But essentially, I kind of did exactly the opposite thing of what my old man did. My father was a very impatient old bastard, was not a very good teacher. And what I wanted to do was this. The one thing I realized that when my father took me fishing, he also wanted to fish at the same time, which I think is when you are trying to teach your kids or any kid to fish, the focus has got to be on them, because the moment the teacher decides that they're going to bring a rod along and think I can teach and fish, that's when problems occur. That's when the first couple of times I tried doing it with my kids, I thought I could just hand them a rod, give them a couple of basics, and then they could, kind of do things on their own. And then when they weren't able to, they got tangled. I got a little frustrated because I was trying to fish. So the one thing I would say I did, the only thing I did really well with my kids the first couple times was the first 6 months for each of my kid, I did not pick up a rod. I did not fish myself. It was just working with them. And it was just, basics. I mean, that was it. And I would say the one thing with teaching with kids, and it's interesting because I have a brother that lives in Montana, and the fly shop that he works at has signs or stickers in the shops that says Montanans for Tenkara free, something like that. There's a lot of hate relationships between and bad blood between Tenkara and traditional fly fishing. Yeah. I use both. I use both, and I will say one thing. I think Tenkara fishing is one of the most brilliant tools for teaching people how to fish. Yeah. Because one, it's intuitive. There is no line. There's no reel. When you look at beginners, a lot of the beginning classes I do, as soon as you start casting, you can see their line hand starting to get aggressive. That they don't know what they want to do with their line hand. There's a reel there, and it overwhelms them. What's nice about the fixed line presentation with Tenkara is the line hand is off to the side, and all they need to worry about is just the rod hand. And what's great about the Tenkara rods as well is just the long limp tip, where essentially all you need is just a flip of the wrist to make the cast work for short range casting. And line control, everything, there's no stripping in line, there's no reeling in the line, everything's done with the rod hand. So it is something that my kids, as soon as I switched from a traditional rod to the Tenkara system with my kids, you could just see within 5 minutes they grasped it. They got the concept down. Yeah. And the other thing too is, when I was a kid, the biggest misconception about teaching kids is they're small, they don't have much power, so we're going to give them a 6 to 7 foot fly rod, which I think is a horrible mistake because one, a kid is already short to begin with, and they don't have the leverage. So the worst thing you can do is actually give them a shorter lever to make the cast. And the other thing is with traditional action fly rods, you've got a force. You need to actually accelerate. You need to accelerate with the rod tip to get the line to load the rod. What's nice about those rods with the Tenkara is the only power that is needed to actually generate the line is just a simple flip of the wrist. That's what those soft tips do so well. So I would really recommend Tenkara for anyone, whether they're going into trout fishing or taking them to a bluegill pond. But the Tenkara tool is just amazing for getting people into casting and also getting them into fish relatively fast. Yeah,
those are good tips for sure. We've talked a little bit about Tenkara on here, and I've never tried it myself, but I think I'm going to give it a shot just because it sounds super effective, especially in some of those areas. Whether you're kind of the smaller creeks, that sort of habitat. Those are with the kids. thinking about tips, those are awesome tips. What do you think as far as if you had, again, somebody who's out there trying to get into some fish, maybe fairly new, do you have any general tips that just from overall, just generally fly fishing that, you'd give a new person?
Yeah. So, I mean, a couple things. One, like we have a couple streams here in Central PA. There's one in particular called Spring Creek. It's a low gradient spring creek, essentially, that's maybe averages, I don't know, maybe 15 to 20 inches in depth. It's very, very shallow. So, and we have about 3,000 fish per mile, which is pretty good by Eastern standards. So, and the fish are used to angling pressure because they get hit hard day in, day out. But they're very easy to please on average. So normally, anytime you need to get some quick wins is what I'm saying. You don't take a beginner or anyone that wants to learn a new technique onto a stream where they may or may not get feedback, because doing the technique right is one thing, but doing the technique right and then getting feedback from the trout or from the fish basically tells the angler, it basically seals the deal saying, okay, this is working. When it doesn't, when you're not making the cast, when you're not doing the right thing, you're not catching fish. But the moment you start doing the right thing, you catch. So it's those little, bits of feedback that are important to basically kind of build that muscle memory, and also the muscle memory in the mind to give you the encouragement to remember the things that catch the fish for you. So find some quick wins, and then eventually you can challenge yourself, go to other waters, but find those quick wins. So that's, I would say, would be one of my number one tips. And then, you can't hack. We live in a time right now where, everyone wants to hack the system.
Yeah.
And there are definitely tools that there are things that you can do that will basically, cut the learning curve sometimes in half, maybe even more so. But experience on the water is one thing, and one of the best things you can do, and this is just a shameless promotion for myself and the people in my community, but hire a good guide. Basically, I mean, yeah. It's amazing how people will spend $700, $800, $900 on incredible equipment, but they won't take a lesson. If you could just take a lesson from even like a 4-hour lesson, and that learning curve, the information that they're going to give you is going to cut that learning curve in half. As long as you have a good instructor. So take a lesson, buy the best equipment that you can afford, but do everything you can to educate yourself the best of your abilities.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I had a guest on a while back, and he was talking about the same thing, the fact that it's probably going to save you. It's actually going to save you money in the long term, because you're not going to be buying more gear to fix the problems with your casting or whatever. You're already going to know how to cast the right way. But I totally agree. I think getting a guide is a smart move. I had a question here from somebody. I'm trying to think. That came out. I guess this was Troy, and it was about water temps. And maybe I can just read it off really quick. This is just kind of a general question here. But he's basically asking, water types at different temperatures, and how will fish change water types based on temperature. So, if you have you start out with a lower temperature, and then as you go through the day, the water increases in temperature. How do fish change where they lie? Is that something you could talk a little bit about?
I can talk a little bit about the experience on my home waters. And streams are just like human beings. I mean, we all have our different attitudes and our demeanors about us. And the same thing is true with streams. We have like 4 really well-known limestone spring creeks in the area, and each of those 4 have a very drastically different behavior in the way where fish hold and so forth. But, with water temperatures, it depends on where you're living. If you are fishing like a spring creek or like a spring creek or maybe like a tailwater where you have a more consistent temperature, meaning it's not going to be fluctuating up and down drastically throughout the course of the day. Fish will be spread out evenly. I mean, in the rifts, in the runs, and in the pools, even the shallow feeding lies. Where, I'm not sure the waters that you fish, but we also have some freestones up north. And the freestone streams, when you look at the go onto the USGS water data site, and a lot of these stations will do gauges of like CFS discharge. They'll look at temperature. They'll look at pH and so forth. But if you look at the temperature on some of our limestone / even like the tailwaters, temperatures won't fluctuate more than maybe sometimes 4 or 5 degrees over the course of maybe 24 hours. But if you go to a freestone stream, I mean, I've seen temperatures fluctuate, 20 degrees, and that's a huge shift. And the greater the shift, the greater the movement is going to occur within the stream itself. So it really is a case by case study. It really just depends on where you're fishing and what the water temperature is doing. Because I mean, even in the wintertime, people say, well, fish, optimum temperature for trout are like 55 to 60 degrees. That's true, but when you are fishing like a spring creek in central PA in January, and you have a temperature that's 33 to 34 degrees, it's just above freezing. I've had some of the best midge hatches where I've seen fish, actively feeding on the surface and chasing midge pupa, midge larvae, incredibly, just with ferocity at water temperatures, in the mid 30s. So again, it just, I hate putting a blanket statement on something saying this is what's going to happen when you see this temperature. Right. It really depends on where you're at.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And maybe just if you had to put a general statement on, maybe I guess you're talking about some pretty cold temperatures, but when you get the really warm temperatures, depending on, again, where you're talking about, it can, I guess, kind of put down fish, right? They kind of get a little lackadaisical, that sort of thing.
When you get water temps like that, usually they're going to be seeking colder water, which is going to have more dissolved oxygen. So often, depending on the stream, if you have like lots of water where there's like really deep water where water is going to stratify a little bit. So slow, deep, pools on the bottom of the pools, you're going to have some colder water temperatures on the bottom. Or if you don't have those deep depths, you're going to see the fish often near the head of the run where you have a riffle going into a pool. That riffle is creating bubbles. It's oxygen, dissolved oxygen. That's the only source, and that's where they're going to be stacked up at during extreme weather conditions like that. But usually back home, like once temperatures hit 66, 67, I lay off the fishing for trout, and then that's when I usually go more into the carp and the bass fishing locally.
Gotcha. So what when you're out there fishing and guiding, what sort of techniques and flies and stuff like that do you typically fish? You do more streamers or nymphs or dries or a little bit of everything?
A little bit of everything. I mean, people come to me. I mean, it's you write books on nymph fishing. That's all they think you know how to do. But yeah, I do probably maybe 60% guiding, mostly with nymph fishing. A lot of the Euro stuff, but also traditional indicator and tight line techniques. And then we have, I mean, in Central PA, from the months of like mid-April on an average year to about the middle part of June, you've got some of our best hatches in the East Coast, and where I live, the limestone streams, any significant hatch in the East Coast, our streams one of the 4 are going to harbor that hatch, and you might have 4 or 5, sometimes 6, 7, major hatches going on at one time. So with the right conditions, I mean, if you like to match the hatch and fish technical dry fly fishing to fish focusing on specific bugs, Central PA in that time frame is just a phenomenal time. So the dry flies are great. Streamer time now. That's our fish are just starting to get on the beds right now. So this is when I kind of leave the trout alone for a couple of weeks, and I target more musky. We have a couple musky fisheries locally, so that's my love right now. I mean, I love trout fishing, but if I could do one thing right now is just chase musky. That's really all I want to do on my time off. So I do the musky thing, but then as soon as post spawn, about 2 to 3 weeks after the spawn occurs, I think that's when some of your best streamer fishing is happening. It's just there's not as many bugs that are hatching. You might get some midge hatching, but unlike the rest of the time of the year where you have all these mayflies and other insects, caddis that are hatching and emerging, so you get a lot of these drifting periods of other insects. This part, post-spawn till about the middle part of March, there's very little insect activity that's actually occurring. So I really find that it's the time where trout are very opportunistic towards larger bait fish. Now you can catch fish on streamers, year round, but it seems like, that later March, April time period, when it seems like our fish will make a complete shift from forage to eating insects because there's just so much availability for the insects. But before then, I'm telling you, like that coldest time of the year is probably my favorite time to throw streamers. Gotcha.
And you mentioned musky. What is that something that you don't really guide? It sounds like that's more of just a thing you do in your off time. Is that also kind of a destination type of fishery, would you say? It sounds like something that's a little bit under the radar. I've heard a few people talk about it, but it doesn't get as much as much play as the saltwater stuff. What's your take on the whole musky fishery?
I mean, it's I love it because there's not much in fly fishing that gets me really amped and excited, but it's from a fishery standpoint. You go down to the south, like where Blaine's Chocolate guides and a lot of those Virginia, they've got great musky fishing. But, the thing is they've got some good musky fishing. Wisconsin's got some good musky fishing. But there's some damn good fishing in like Northeast that no one really knew about or no one ever talked about. And, I have a musky fishery 15 minutes away from my house. It's not great, but there's musky there. I live on the Susquehanna River. The Susquehanna River, is, I forget how many 100 miles or so before it goes into the Chesapeake. But in most of that water, there are muskie sporadically, spaced throughout. So we have got, not a lot of muskies, but if you are willing to do the homework, fish a lot, find the few spots that they hold, you can find some muskie close by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like it's definitely something that's on my radar. I'd love to get after that eventually. Yeah, you mentioned a little bit ago about Euro nymphing. We weren't going to talk much about nymphing, but I did have a question just thinking about the whole Euro nymphing because I have had a couple of guests, and actually Devin Olsen, who I had on, I think it was one of my bigger episodes, and it was probably because it had the Euro nymphing in the title, but I know when we were chatting, you said something about maybe Euro nymphing is a little saturated. I was wondering if you could talk about what that means, or what do you think the current status is of Euro nymphing and what you meant about saturated?
No, yeah, what I mean by oversat is that it is definitely a hot topic, and I get more questions about Euro nymphing than anything else. But it's just there's just so much emphasis on Euro nymphing. I think it's effective. Don't get me wrong; it catches fish, but the one thing that, for me at least, from a fly fishing standpoint, is being a complete angler. And and I listened to the podcast. I listened to the episode that Devin was there, and the thing is, like what separates like good comp anglers, because I know when I competed, I was a pretty good angler back in the day, decent, not great, but I held my own, did well in some comps. But the difference between like the top 5, top 10% versus the other 90% was this. In all these guys I know that are competing now, not on the U.S. team, but are on their regional teams and so forth, all they know how to do is chuck heavily weighted flies on a monofilament rig. Now, it catches fish, but if you find yourself on the Delaware River or the Henry's Fork during peaks, PMD or sulfur time, and you have the only way to catch a fish is casting 50 feet downstream to a fish that's sipping PMDs, and you need to make a downstream presentation with a nice reach cast to the left. There's most of the guys on the U.S. fly fishing team can do it. Guys like Lance, Devin, a guy named Pat Weiss, and a handful of others. Those guys are great all-around anglers. You can put them in any scenario, whether it's dry flies, nymphs, wets, and they can get it done. And that's why they are good, and that's why they do well in comps. But the rest of the field, and all they ever do is just talk about Euro nymphing, they're going to suffer. They don't know how to cast. They don't know how to cast light the way it flies. They don't. You don't. And I'm not talking about like being an entomologist where you need to know the Latin of everything, but there are times when you are fishing bug-specific rivers. Again, like on the Henry's Fork, the Delaware, the South Holston, where those fish become very bug-centric. I mean, a sulfur may come off, or an ice snake, a specific insect that has a unique physical characteristic and also a behavior in the water that trout are not overly intelligent, but they key in on specific ways that insect is moving in the water. And if you're not able to understand what those fish are doing and what the bugs are doing and how they're reacting to it, you're not able to do that. And what I'm saying by oversaturated is all they talk about is just casting heavily weighted flies. That's great. It catches fish, but to be a good all-around angler, I think you need to kind of just step outside your comfort zone. Because in all honesty, when I teach beginners, my philosophy with teaching is I get most of the time I teach them Euro nymphing because it's very intuitive. Usually it's a fixed line presentation where you're just casting and leading your flies. It's not really casting as much as just lobbing. So it's pretty straightforward. And then when they are excited and they want to progress, then we talk about casting, then we talk about mending and so forth. So all I'm saying is that you just need to kind of expand and not just oversaturate with just the Euro, but learn all aspects of the game, because if you're going to be fishing year-round on waters near and far, you need to know more than just the Euro game.
Let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. The Portland Fly Shop, located in the Pearl District in downtown Portland, with over 50 years of combined fly fishing experience in the Pacific Northwest. The Portland Fly Shop has all the gear and knowledge you need to find success, whether on the river or behind the vise. One of Hairline's top 100 dealers in the nation, they have a great fly tying selection and carry all of the top brands, including Sage, Loomis, Hatch, Airflow, and many more. They are your winter steelhead headquarters with over 13 years of guiding experience and 20 years of professional fly tying knowledge. They will get you dialed in on the vise or on the rodder. And I remember actually when I first met Jason, it was a number of years ago in another fly shop, and I knew right away that he totally knew his stuff and he was a super cool guy. So it was pretty cool and surprising when I walked into the Portland shop for the first time and saw the same friendly face there that I remembered from a few years back. So really cool local story here. They offer a wide range of guided trips, adventures up to the Olympic Peninsula and Upper Columbia if you want to kind of get out there without having to go too far. And you can give them a call at 503-265-8060 or visit them online at theportlandflyshop.com. Portland, born and bred, on-site parking just 2 turns off of 405. We are also brought to you by the Gray Drake, who produces high-quality vintage fly wallets and boxes. Their motto, progress through tradition, respect through stewardship. The fly wallets are handmade in the USA with sustainable cork, and these boxes are naturally self-healing, which essentially means that it can hold a little tiny midge or some big daddy stoneflies, and it'll last and hold the flies for years to come. The Ho River wallet is kind of the Rolls Royce of fly storage. Double lined leather and calf skin protects your flies. High quality wool includes a way to pull out moisture out of the fly. And you'll definitely be proud to pass this one on to the next generation. I personally I've always loved the fly wallets. I remember studying the old wallets that were passed down from my grandfather and my dad, and there's nothing that really comes close to feeling those old those wallets. And Telroy, the wallet the Gray Drake has here is kind of sharing that same tradition. So it's pretty cool, a classic feel, and reminds me of kind of the old days. So right now the Gray Drake is donating a portion of proceeds from all sales through the end of the year to Wild Steelheaders United to help defend remaining runs of wild steelhead in the Pacific Northwest and Idaho. Head over to thegreydrake.com to grab your Flybox wallet today. That's THEGREY Drake.com. Okay, back to the show.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned the tip, the being bug centric. When the fish are in that kind of that zone where they're, what would you? Is there a tip for that if somebody finds themselves out there and they're when, bug centric, that means they're focused on a single species of bug that's coming off.
So, I'm not an entomologist, but, and I don't do many plugs for other people's work, even though I read countless books. But a friend of mine named Paul Weimer wrote a book, and he would be a great, if you're ever looking for like an etymology.
Yeah, I am.
He would be great, but he wrote a book. It turned out it was like an e-log, not an e-log book, but like an online book that eventually became a hardback, but it's called the Bug Book. But if you have a second grade reading level ability, and that's what he did, he basically took something that is incredibly complex and complicated and basically talked about all the insects. He broke them down into species, and then within the species talked about the insects that are the most important to the trout, and basically in like 4 or 5 sentences with each one talked about how they hatch, any key features, whether like you're talking about like a sulfur, like a splitback, where when you have this yellow mayfly that's trying to break out of its nymphal shuck, you'll have this yellow splitback as a name, and that color variation is something that the trout may key in on. But long story short, he talks about the insects in a very simple manner and how they behave and what the angler needs to do to mimic that behavior. So what I'm saying is buy the book. It's $15. You can't go wrong. And find out where you're fishing and what hatches are occurring during that time period. And just basically not only match the hatch, but more importantly, match the behavior of the fish. And that book will help you out.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's I'm always looking for good resources, and I'll put a link to that book in the show notes. This will be at wetflyswing.com/54. I'll have all the links that we talk about here. And I just want to touch on a little bit more on the competitive angling, because you have some experience there. I guess you were on the US team.
Yeah, I did the adult team, I think, for 6 years, and then I coached the adult team for 2 years, and I also coached the United States youth team for 2.5 years. So yeah, I had a good run, but it was just time to get out. I look at guys like Lance and Devin, and those guys make a lot of sacrifices. They were very focused on competitive fly fishing, and that's why they've done really well. I had a short run. I did really well, but in order to stay at the level that Lance and Devin fish at, you've got to put so much time and energy into that. And with a business I had, with my writing, with a growing family, it was just time for me to leave. I had a great run, had learned a lot, but it was just time to get out of the game.
What would you tell? I hear a little bit of this out there, and I'm not sure where it comes from, but I guess it's the competition fishing. Like, people are kind of, there's some people out there that are kind of against competition fishing. Like, they think it's, putting a kind of a negative slant on the whole fly fishing thing. What would you say to somebody that had that sort of take, and, especially since you've been involved in it? What would be your, what sort of benefits do you see of the whole the USA team and all of that's going on?
So what I would say would be this, not to switch subjects, but let's go to bass fishing, for example. Now, I don't want to draw parallels between, the Bass Masters and the U.S. fly fishing team, but you want to look at all the major advances, all the gear, everything if you want to look at a real professional, someone in a field that does the R&D, the research, and is always cutting edge, coming up with new gizmos, gadgets, fishing equipment, you look at the bass circuit. What feeds all that R&D is the competition. Competition breeds ingenuity. It breeds progression. You need that competition because you're always looking for the next edge. You switch now back to fly fishing. You look at whether you love them or not, like the squirmy wormies, the mops, okay? Those are patterns that were used in competition fishing that were so effective that the general public took over. You look at a lot of the European nymphing rods. When even like 10 years ago when I wrote my first book, we were using traditional action fly rods. But now, because of competition fishing, the techniques and the equipment that you use and all the equipment that you see now available has been refined over the last 5-6 years to almost perfection, based on these guys that are going out competing and looking for the next edge. You know, like with leaders. I mean, the big thing with European nymphing now is going thin with as thin as possible with your leader. It makes sense because it goes back to your bait fishing days. You look at the guys that are fishing redworms on like 6-pound test. Long story short, the thinner the material, or the thinner or the less weight you have within the guides and outside the guides, the more direct contact you have with your flies. So if you have a fly line or even a heavily weighted leader or a traditional tapered leader in the guides and outside the rod tip, there's a mass. And with that mass, there's a small degree of sag. And that sag is going to create some sort of disconnect between you and your flies. The big thing now is essentially these guys are just doing level leaders when they're nymphing. I mean, they're just basically all straight 6-pound tests. And when you do that, it just gives you a straighter line connection, and it gives you so much more increase in sensitivity. But what breeds that was the competition, was the anglers looking for the next edge. You look at jig hooks, for example. It's about efficiency, not getting hung up nearly as much, not losing your flies. The Czechs were some of the first to actually introduce jig hooks in the competition circuit. So
was that because they didn't? That wasn't because they didn't have any other hooks. They were just using kind of gear type hooks. It was because they actually sought those out. Because I guess it was the Polish team that had more. They were coming out with the ones that didn't have rods and stuff at the beginning, right?
Yeah, definitely the Czechs. But even like I would say probably 10 years ago, jigs were not kind of a known commodity. But the Czechs, from what I gather, were actually bending their own hooks. But taking what they know from the terminal, or taking it from the other side, like the bass fishing and so forth, but basically understand that the hooks are going to invert. They claim that maybe you get a better hooking percentage, but also anytime you want to add movement or put movement into that fly, I mean, you can basically turn your nymph into a clouser minnow by just simply putting a slide tungsten bead onto a 90-degree bend hook, and then you could tip just tap the rod tip, and all of a sudden you add additional movement into your fly. So what I'm saying is competition just breeds the ingenuity. And here's the other thing too, whether you like competition fishing or not, I don't like gymnastics really. I don't like curling, so to speak. I don't like, all these Olympic events, but I watch the Olympics because I am watching the best in their respective fields in the world. And even though I don't really follow any of these sports specifically, there's something to be said about watching the best in their field do what they do in the open. And whether you agree with competitive fly fishing or not, whenever you had people, vendors, or just the general public watching these guys fish, and sometimes ladies fish along the water, it was an incredible learning curve. So many of the people that, when I was on there, were opposed to competitive fly fishing, they would come by just to watch. And I would say 99% of them would come back and say, you would, thank you so much. You have no idea how much I learned by just watching this guy fish for a few moments. So don't knock it until you try it, or in this case, just, whether you like competition fishing or not, it's going to progress our sport. It's going to create better equipment, better tools. And then also it's just the power of observation. Just by watching the best in their field, you are going to have to really work hard not to improve your skills. You almost have to be blind. Yeah. So that's what my, elevator spiel would be for the fly fishing.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's great. And what do you think, going back to the musky, do you have a couple of musky fly patterns you like to use if somebody was going to go out there and try to find some?
There's a couple. I love tying flies, but to be honest with you, I bought probably last year about $300 worth of saddles and so forth. Tying nymphs and tying wet flies and so forth, it's pretty easy to tie flies that are designed to drift and even sometimes swim or swing. But with musky flies, these flies are so large and bulky. Tapers have got to be precise. So it just takes 50 to almost an hour to tie these flies. So I buy my flies from a couple local. But I would definitely look at the Game Changers by like Blaine Chocolate. Like his T-bone is a great pattern, and then another pattern is a guy named Joe Goodspeed. Joe is a friend of mine. He is the rod designer or one of the rod designers for Thomas and Thomas. He's got a handle on Instagram called Teeth and Trout. But he is eccentric. He is a lunatic, but probably one of the more brilliant minds in fly fishing. This guy. Just to kind of let you know, he's got a pattern called the mop head, and I can't even explain the basically, but he's got some things that if you go onto his Instagram account, you're going to see these incredibly well thought out patterns called the mop head, which is basically like just goop over top of Senio laser dub, but he basically molds these heads like plastics for musky. But Joe's a brilliant thinker because what he does, he tries to get inside the mind of the fish, which is sometimes a scary proposition. But muskie are an apex predator. They are the top of the food chain. What is so fascinating about the muskie is this. They will follow their prey 30, 40 feet. I mean, I've had fish follow the fly. I mean, it's amazing. And what is so amazing with these fish is that they are not spooked and by the boat. Rarely are they spooked by the boat. And that's why they talk about the figure eight. But what is so fascinating about the muskie is that you can work your fly. You think you have a pretty good view of your fly in the surrounding areas. But all of a sudden you bring your fly in, and then no matter what, even you do or do not see a fish behind you, always finish the presentation out with a figure eight. And you can make 100 casts, and then all of a sudden on this one cast, you're in clear water. You don't see anything. You're starting to sweep your flies into that figure eight pattern right in front of the boat. And before you know it, like this head just appears. It's like a ghost. It appears. And it's right on your fly, like, 6 inches behind your fly. 9 out of 10 times, they don't even take it. 9 out of 10 times if you're actually lucky. But they will follow. They know what to look for. And Joe is one of these guys where he tries to deceive them. So people talk about putting flies, like eyes on their flies. Joe is like, he's under the mentality like, I don't want flies, because 2 flies on my fly is indicating a fish that has good vision and is a prey that can see its predators. So what he's trying to do is, I don't want eyes on my fly. I'm trying to create a scenario where the muskie is coming up and seeing that, oh, it's a blind fish. It can't see. That's the world that friend and go.
That's cool though. Like a wounded, it's just like any animal out there. The predator is going to take down the weak deer, right, or the weak whatever animal. That they're not going to go for the strongest one.
Exactly, and that goes into play. I mean, I've had a couple of friends that were in special ops, and they would do whether it was tours or what their duty, wherever they were. Like if they were in like jungles and whatnot, one of the things that you would do when you're in jungles and when there's lions and cats, large cats around, they would tell you is that you put your sunglasses, on the back of your hat. Basically, and what that would look like if a cat was, because a lot of times these cats will come up from behind and attack you. But by switching the sunglasses is basically representing that there's a set of eyes in the back of your head looking out. Whether it works or not, but that's their mentality. But that's the same thing with that Joe is trying to tell his flies not to do. So yeah, it's just interesting. But Joe is just a brilliant guy, and if you really want to, I mean, I'm a hack. I've only been doing this for about 3 years, but that's all I do. I devour as much information. I spend as much time on musky fishing as possible. But I would say, definitely Blaine Chocolate, who has a book coming out called Game Changer here pretty soon. But it talks about designing flies specifically that swim, and a lot of it's on musky fishing. But then also Joe Goodspeed with Instagram. Joe is a guy that I think probably catches more big muskie than any other guy I know. He's just a fishy guy and has got a pretty good approach to his game.
Yeah, it sounds like you're pretty passionate about muskie, and it also sounds like it is kind of I don't know, I mean, it sounds to me like it's a good destination fishery that that people would want to go to and check out, especially the way you're talking about it. What do you think? You've written so much about nymphs and nymphing and all that stuff. What makes you, what gets you tired about talking about nymphing? Is that, and you're so passionate about this other thing, is it just a little switch, or what is it now with the nymph? Is that something, obviously you still do it a lot, but just, talking about it, getting into it, is it just a natural progression?
Maybe it's a natural progression, but it's just something different. I mean, honestly, I've got a great job, and I love fishing, but and I'm on the water probably for trout, probably close to 250 to 280 days a year for trout. And that is fishing for myself or guiding. So it's nice to kind of get away from, and to be honest with you, anytime you have an advancement, whether it's a thought or some sort of progression in your game, it's the only time that's ever happened to me is actually when I stepped away from it and actually just given myself a break from it. So I love nymphing, and I do it a lot. And one of the things I love about like European nymphing, it's a very thought provoking. It's very engaging technique where instead of watching the bobber, which the bobber is controlling everything for you, you are in the driver's seat. You don't have the bobber controlling your drift. You have to look at the speed and the depth of the water, and you have to determine how fast to lead your flies, how slow to move your rod tip, and so forth. So I love that about the nymph fishing, but I like hunting too, and like going down to the flats. My wife and I would go down to the Bahamas, try to like once or twice every 2 years. We haven't done this in a long time, but there's something about stalking, like hunting fish. Like when you are fishing for trout with nymphs, you're fishing, but when you're fishing for musky or when you're doing any sort of sight fishing, you're hunting. It's that predatory man. And to me, that is so much more exciting knowing when I'm actually hunting something, and especially something like a musky, where here's the thing, when you do something right with nymph fishing and you're in a good trout, in a good trout stream and in the right condition, you can catch lots of fish. The first 8 times I went out with a guide or a friend for musky fishing, I got my ass beat. I had some fish follow. I messed up a couple hook sets because but you can go, the return on investment is not there. But what's nice about it is the more suffering you put into it, the more work you go into it, the benefit and the reward is that much greater. And that's what musky fishing is to me. Is just, I bought a boat, and I'm one of the most frugal guys, but I bought a boat specifically for musky fishing, just because of how passionate. But nothing will make me more excited than going out fishing for 3-4 days and not seeing a fish. And then on that 4th or 5th day, having a fish come in and just follow your fly on a figure 8, eating the fly at the boat and sticking the fish. And it's taken so much time and effort, maybe a couple days to get that, to all the stars to align up. So yeah. I just love it because it's so much work, but it's such a great reward at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's cool. Do you have a musky, if you had one musky tip to give somebody?
That's a good question. One musky tip.
Or I don't know if it's. I'm just coming from a newbie sort of thing. So I'm just thinking there's lots of trout fishing tips, but is musky, that you talk about the predator prey thing. Is it that much different than, say, if you look at casting? That was going to be another question. Are there any specific casts that you do for musky that any unique types of techniques or retrieves that you do when you're fishing for them?
Yeah, well, basically with musky fishing, you're trying to use your larger muscles. So most of the time, because you're casting like an 11 or 12 weight and you're casting these flies that are like small little squirrels, you're trying to use the larger muscles. So most often you're trying to cast off your backhand. So that's just going to allow you to suffer longer throughout the course of the day rather than trying to cast on your front side. But from a fishing standpoint, it's probably one of the best tips I got from a friend of mine, another guide named Chris Willen. Just a phenomenal musky guide, great angler, knows his stuff. But with musky fishing, again, sometimes it happens. You can have days where you're having 4 or 5 fish follow to the boat, which is really good. And then there might be a time period where you're fishing 3-4 days and you might not see a damn thing. The thing that kind of keeps you in the game is, believe it or not, throwing large, flashy flies. And that's it, because nothing is more discouraging when you're throwing your flies out into the depth and you're throwing these dull color flies that kind of blend in the water you can't see. And all you're doing is just looking into this water, not seeing anything, and you're just stripping, and you're working your ass off, and you're not getting anything. But as long as you can put that brightly colored chartreuse fly or that white fly, but something that you can see really well, as long as you can see that fly, that keeps you in the game. It just gives you the motivation. So I would say throw brightly colored flies, to be honest with you.
And how long might you go between hookups or some sort of positive feedback fishing for muskie?
It all depends on fronts, water systems, conditions, and so forth. I mean, like fall right now, fall is a prime time. So it's just when they're starting to put that feedback back really on before like the heart of our winter season kicks in. You should be moving, like normally I'm moving the fish like once or twice every day consistently. If I'm doing things right, I should be moving sometimes 3 to 4 fish on a good condition, and maybe sticking 1 or 2 of those fish.
Okay.
But then, I mean, there are times where all of a sudden we have high water now. We've got high water where I've been like 3 days now in a row without moving a fish. It's just difficult with flies and the equipment that we use, because you want to talk about the most inefficient way to actually target fish. You put a fly line on it. That's if you want to catch fish and so forth, you know the deal. But so it depends on the conditions. But normally 3-4 days is the longest I've been without seeing something. But normally, if you got to find the water, and that's why I bought a jet boat, because fish are holding in specific spots, and it's not like where you're on a trout water where fish are evenly spread out for the most part. Like you might have 8-10 miles of river, and there might only be like 1 or 2 holes, and in those 2 holes there might only be like a couple corners or some slow deep spots within those pools, and that's where the majority of your fish are going to be holding for the most part. So you've got to hit the spots,
Gotcha.
And that's just knowing the water.
What kind of jet boat? What kind of boat? Like what size or what type? I'm trying to picture it in my mind what it looks like.
Oh, it's a pretty basic. All of this it's just it's a 30 horsepower jet with a nice flat boat, aluminum boat. That's it. Yep.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yep.
All right. Well, we're getting pretty closer. I had a little rapid fire round I was hoping to bust out, but before I got there, I just had one question just about, again, back in your past. Is there, some sort of a turning point that, you talked about some of the stuff you did earlier in your career, where you're doing some stuff that wasn't fly fishing specific. Is there something that sticks out that caused you to turn and go all in? Now you're a full-time guide and all that to get to where you are?
Yeah, man, I wouldn't say.
Or I guess the other way to look at it would be, have you ever thought, did you ever think about kind of, not staying in it or quitting, or is it something that you see yourself where you're, kind of going till the end?
Basically, I was going to, I probably would have died trying to get into this. This was just something that when I was 14 years old, I bought my first fly fishing book, and that was Joe Humphries' Trout Tactics. And even today, it's one of the most relevant books. If you want to learn about trout fishing in general, that is a great book. But when I found out that there was this guy in central PA that was about an hour and a half away south of me at that time before I moved, that taught at Penn State angling and basically made a career teaching how to fly fish. When I read that book, I mean, that was it. Like, that's what I'm going to do. I mean, whether it's teaching it, but so from that point on, it was my mission. Now, like my wife will tell you, like her family, when, we've been now married for now 17 years coming up, but we've been together for 21, 22 years. But when they found out that, their daughter or, their niece or whatever was in love with this fishing mom, they're like, there's no way this guy is going to make a living for himself. But basically it was just, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. But the other thing too is, you just don't go out there bullheaded and just full charge. You look at people that were successful, and that's one of the things that drew me to Joe. You look at a guy like Joe, and even other guides that were full-time guides, like guys like Pat Dorsey, who's been guiding in Colorado. I mean, this guiding is kind of a new thing within I'd probably say the last 10 years, where people were actually making like actually making careers. But there were guys like Frank and there were guys like Pat Dorsey, 30, 40 years ago that were actually making it. So I knew of a handful of those guys that actually did really well. And I reached out to them and basically I stalked them, just trying to figure out any opportunity, even if it meant like a 5-hour drive, to sit down with these guys for just 30 minutes to talk with them. That's all I wanted to do. And I just picked their brains and eventually came up with a plan that, at least to this day, is fairly successful.
Yeah. No, that's an awesome tip for anybody that's want to go. Yeah, you get out and, well, again, mentors is something I ask a lot of my guests about, and you took it, that next step, which everybody should, is to get out there and make the effort to connect with these people. And Joe, I'm looking forward to hearing more about, because I don't have the whole story on Joe. I know a little bit. Is he, I guess he was a guide for a good chunk of time, but can you talk just briefly about his kind of life story and how, it just seems amazing how you connected with one of the biggest names that's out there, how that all came to be.
Yeah, Joe's been doing some guiding and instruction, but his thing was basically, Joe in his youth was a troublemaker or got into a lot of trouble. And basically there was a book called Just Fishing. It was a classic book called Just Fishing. And his parents, just as an act of desperation, gave Joe this book, just hoping. And then Joe all of a sudden just took to fishing. As soon as he read this book, Just Fishing, that's all he wanted to do. And it kind of just changed his approach to everything. All of a sudden, he became a great student. He became a good athlete. That one book changed the course of his life. Long story short, he went to Penn State. He did boxing. I think he wrestled for Penn State as well. And then that's when he got to meet a guy named George Harvey. George Harvey taught the first credited fly fishing course in the United States at Penn State. He started back in the 1930s, but Joe started taking that course when he was at Penn State. And basically, it was a mentorship. Just like Joe took me under his wing, George took Joe under his wing, developed a good relationship. But long story short, back in whatever it was, the 60s or 70s, George was going to retire. And he wanted to make sure that the right person was going to be his predecessor. So he got everything lined up for Joe to take over. And then Joe became the next angling professor. And from there, and from there, he wrote 2 books. It was the first televised fly fishing series. It was ESPN. He was the first one to do a series on fly fish on ESPN. And basically that's kind of how he was a great angler from the beginning, but it wasn't until like the 70s when he started writing and really taking over the angling program where he actually started developing some national notoriety. But he's just, it's tough love with Joe. Joe, you got to love him or hate him. And the thing I like about Joe is he doesn't hold any punches. One of the reasons why I did so well in competitive fly fishing is because in competitive fly fishing, you've got to fish under pressure, under time constraints. And there was no greater amount of pressure anyone could be under than when fishing with Joe Humphries. Because Joe was a taskmaster. Because one of my favorite stories about Joe from his wrestling days when he was a coach at a local high school before he took the angling program was he would get his wrestlers all wound up. And if he felt like his wrestler was not just stoked or excited to get on that match, he would literally start smacking you in the face to get you pissed off, to get you rolling. Yeah. And the same thing with fly fishing. Like when I wasn't doing something correctly, he would smack me over the back of the head or take the rod tip and just smack me. Wow. And he would say, "God damn it, that's not how you do it." But when Joe, if Joe didn't care about you, he wouldn't have said anything. He would just, turn his head and just. But that's Joe. I quickly realized that was Joe's way of saying I care. And as soon as I realized that, I took that as a compliment because he was trying to allow me to become a better angler. So it's been a great relationship with Joe. I owe Joe an immense amount. And, we spent a lot of time on the water together. But the one thing I will say about Joe is he gave you encouragement. And, you can spend time with anybody, but I think the best gift anyone that you look up to can give you is not only their time, but giving you their encouragement, saying that you can do this, you can do that. And, even when I had times of doubt about whether I wanted to go into the fly fishing career and so forth, Joe was always very supportive, saying, here are some things to think about, but you can do this.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't say you're going to rock it, but, he had the faith and he gave me the encouragement. And when you get that from the right person, it's amazing how that can fuel you during the low times in your life.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. That's a really cool story. And this angling professor, it sounds like maybe you're going to be in line to take over when Joe steps down, huh? Is that the next step?
Joe stepped down a couple of years ago.
Oh, he's down. Okay.
Yeah, but he's still very active. He does some teaching, but there's been a couple of guys. So the job might come available at some point, and I would definitely be interested. But as of right now, I really love what I do. I do, I guide about 120 days a year. I don't do any more than that. I have great clients. My year's already filled for 2019. I do a lot of clinics. I get to travel a lot, and that's the one thing I love about the clinics is because with the guiding, and I don't want to hold you up here, but the thing about guiding is that when you guide on the same water for 200 to 220 days a year, which I could easily do here in this part, I find that people who just stay at the same spot doing the same, they develop a groove. And I don't want to get stuck in the groove. The one thing that has kept me open-minded to outside ideas is I'll do my guiding, but when I travel and do speaking engagements, I will almost always hire local guides or fish with local guides in that area. And when I do that, I'm always introduced to new ideas and concepts. And it's that constant flow of new information that kind of keeps things fresh for me and really reduces the chance of me going further and further into a ditch or my own ditch.
That's a great point. Nice. Well, we're getting closer. Do you have a little bit of time for a quick little rapid fire round?
Sure.
All right. I just have a few questions I always like to before we get out of here. And the first one, you've talked about a ton of resources and books and things like that. Is there anything else, like a book, magazine, video, anything that think would be helpful for somebody? Just generally I guess we've talked a little bit about musky fishing, but just generally for fly fishing.
Yeah, I would say probably one of the best learning tools, and it's another shameless promotion, but I work with a little bit with the Orvis Company, and I would say the Orvis Learning Center it's an absolute wealth of knowledge. Anything from knot tying to basic casting. They have a guy named Peter Kutzer on there that is just an amazing fly casting instructor to showing you all kinds of rigs based on the conditions, and not just for trout, but for all species. So I would highly recommend the Orvis Learning Center as a great resource for not just a beginner, but even I find myself going on there a couple times a week just to remember some of the things I've forgotten, or even some new things I haven't learned yet. So Great resource.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. No, it's good. Do you have a top piece of like a go-to piece of gear that you use? Maybe a non-fly fishing, something maybe while you're traveling or out there doing your stuff?
From a fishing standpoint, that's not fly fishing gear. I would probably say the rubber twist ties. If you're familiar with it, they're just basically like if you look at like the bread, bread loaves, how you have those little rubber twist ties. That was an idea I got from the Tenkara guys from Daniel. But anytime you are fishing droppers on like your flies, for example, and your flies are just hanging, even just a 2-minute walk from one spot to the other, it's guaranteed that by the time you reach your next spot, that dropper is going to be tangled or wrapped around your rod several times. Yeah. So those little twist ties are great for that. But then too, anytime I just use twist ties. I use a raft. I use boats. So I use them in different lengths and diameters. But I just use that to basically jerry rig a lot of my stuff and keep things hanging off my vest or keep things close together where they need to be. So right. That would probably be one of my top tools.
Nice. And we mentioned kind of musky flies. Do you have a top, if you had to say one trout fly, that you put on with either your clients or kind of your go-to fly? Can you pull out one or two?
Yeah, this year, again, it's all you. every year you develop new confidence patterns. But I would probably say Higa's SOS, his nymph, a friend of mine, Spencer Higa. He's a nice little Mormon boy, so he doesn't swear. So instead of saying "save our asses," this fly is called "save our skins" SOS. So it's Higa's SOS nymph. But it's basically like a zebra midge with a black tail, with a red flashback wing, and some black crystal flash for the legs. But from probably the fly that I've had on my nymphing rig for most of my clients from April all the way till like last week, that SOS pattern has probably accumulated for more fish than any other pattern in my box. So the SOS I would recommend.
Okay, cool. And we again started off talking a little bit about the educational piece and philosophy. Can you sum up your teaching philosophy, or maybe a tip for somebody who's kind of wanting to get into this that sums up how you are such a good teacher? And I mean, obviously you've learned from some great teachers.
So what I would say is this: substance versus style. So learn the fundamentals of the casting, line control, but there are some very similar pieces that when you're talking about casting, there are principles that don't change. So learn those principles, okay? But whatever you do not let yourself, or if you have a guide or a instructor, do not let them, unless absolutely necessary, have them dictate their style to you. Meaning, the thing I am trying to be cognizant of is this: I am 6'3", about $185. I have a long wingspan. There's no way in hell I expect a client that is 5'5", shorter to cast the same way I do. So what I try to do is teach the fundamentals, the basics, but you need to develop your own style. And once you've established your style, your experience, where you fish, that is all going to determine how you create your own style.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's good. Okay, well, that is, I just want to check in one last thing. In the next 6 to 12 months, do you have anything we can expect coming out from you new, anything to keep a lookout for?
Well, most recently, I have a new book called Nymph Fishing. It's the first book on dynamic nymphing was a lot focused on European. This new book is talking about kind of blending the European nymphing techniques along with, just traditional techniques where you need to use split shot. I'm not a comp angler anymore. I try to use the Euro stuff as much as possible, but there are times where you need to use split shot. And basically, I just talk about situations where you need to kind of break the European rules because they have to follow strict rules. We're not competitors. We don't need to follow those rules. Sometimes there's a time and place where you can break those rules and have an advantage. The other thing is I will be having a series of nymphing Euro 101 with the Orvis Learning Center. So basically, it's just a bunch of short clips, maybe 6 to 8 short clips, but just if you're looking about getting into it, it's going to be free, but just some short clips about, the basics, the essentials on what you need to get started. Nothing complicated, just the nuts and bolts of, A to B on the basics of, European nymphing. So that should be out here relatively soon. And then also, if you don't mind, my blog, it's just, you go on my website, Living on the Fly. You can subscribe to but the blog is just basically a series of just random, just comments, just tips. I do 1 or 2 tips a week, but just things that sometimes I forget, or a tip I pick up when I'm traveling, but just something that keeps you fresh, keeps your mind fresh.
What's your just as a last little take on what's your goal with the blog? It takes time to put out that stuff. I mean, when you look at the long term of it, do you have a plan for that thing, or you just kind of do it to write and get some information out there?
I do. I'm always going to be writing books, as far as I know. I'm going to be, even though there's fewer people writing, but reading books. But it keeps me fresh. But then too, it's, I like to help people. I really do. And these are just, there's no stories. It's just a couple sentences or sometimes a couple paragraphs, just talking about a specific thing that I feel that can help someone. So I've already had some opportunities to have sponsorship. There will be no sponsorship. And I'm not trying to make money on it. This is just going to be 1 or 2 tips every week coming from me to help anyone that wants to listen.
Cool. That's awesome. Yeah, it's definitely sounds like that's going to be a great resource. So, okay, George, well, that's all I have. I just wanted to thank you for coming on. And, I think you've obviously got tons of resources out there that people can dig into, but I appreciate you sharing and the stories and everything, too. It was awesome to hear a little bit about Joe Humphries and kind of the stories there. So, yeah, thanks, and we'll hopefully keep in touch with everything you have going.
All right, sounds great, Dave. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, see ya.
And another quick shout out to my man, Tyler. Tyler, thanks for stepping up to the plate. If you want to head over to wetflyswing.com/Patreon, Patreon, where a buck will get you started. It's kind of a cool way just to help the show and at the same time get some a little bit of bonus content over there. So check it out. There's some good stuff.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com. And if you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes.